Hejsan allihopa. How are you? Good? Great. Thank you for sticking out. We're still here, everybody. We're going to have a talk about web analytics development, so I'm very happy to see you all in the audience and not running away. Today we're going to talk about engagement a little bit. We're going to talk about web analytics. I was sitting in the audience and it's been a very nice event. It's been a really great event. Thank you guys. It's been just a wonderful event. Let's give a little love to the organizers. So I think that this is the first time I've been speaking in Sweden, which is crazy because I live just across the Baltic Sea. And so I thought of a funny joke about my name that is actually related to this conference. So my surname is Ahava, which is Hebrew for love, by the way. It's also Finnish for this spring wind that really hurts your face. I don't know, when you combine them, you get interesting stuff. But it's also a typical Swedish web analyst, or any web analyst, but Swedish especially, because as web analysts, we're in this constant state of dissatisfaction. We're constantly unsatisfied. We're constantly angry in a way. Because when we look at data, we have these aha moments, you know? We look at data and we have elucidation, we get inspiration, we are constantly elevated by the things we find. But every time we find something, a whole new set of questions pops up that perplexes us and we're completely bewildered by it. So my name is Simo, and the analyst goes like, aha, va? Aha, va? So, yes, I know, don't quit your day job. But anyway, now to tie it back to this talk in a very meaningful manner. Today, my goal is to not only inspire you with this stuff, but also to get you into this state of dissatisfaction. Make you really unsatisfied, not with the talk and not with the conference and not with anything like that, but with your data. And especially the companies whose tools you use on a daily basis, be it your CRO tools or your web analytics tools or your data store tools or your cloud storage tools. And I want you to be unsatisfied with them because we can't enter a state of complacency. We can't be satisfied with the data that these tools give us. We need to be constantly tweaking and configuring and customizing the data we use, because that's the only way we can make it meaningful for our companies and for our organizations. And I'm going to use the story of engagement to drive this talk forward. And why I'm choosing engagement is because content tracking, like engagement with content, is a great proxy for everything that is so difficult about web analytics. And I hope I'll show you today why that is. So I work at a company called Reactor. I'm a developer by trade these days. I only do analytics as a hobby, which is great. It keeps me motivated. There's no money involved, so I can just do what I want. I represent Google in an unofficial manner in the Google Developer Expert role. The unofficial part means that I get to diss them. I get to call them out on the things they do. And I think that's a very healthy relationship indeed. And I'm also active on all sorts of social media, so feel free to contact me with questions about this presentation, for example. But let's start with plug-and-play analytics. Now, what is plug-and-play analytics? It's when you plug your web analytics tool into your system and then you press play and start collecting the data. It's the default configuration, it's the out-of-the-box configuration that your analytics tools offer you. Google Analytics is pretty easy to implement, especially if you use tools like Google Tag Manager or the new G tag that was introduced a while ago. You basically just need to add a snippet of code on the site and data will be flowing in. Now the question is this data useful? And this is a dashboard, a very basic dashboard in Google Analytics that has some of the metrics we're accustomed to seeing in these out-of-the-box setups. We have things like page views, so content digestion in a way, content being viewed, page views of content, something like that. We talk about bounce rates and conversion rates, so that's a good metric, I think, for most. And then we have this concept of a session, right? We have sessions underlying almost everything in a web analytics tool. Sessions is the key driver of Google Analytics data. It's the most basic unit of aggregation you can find in the tool if you discount hit level stuff like page views. But have you ever stopped to consider what a Google Analytics session is? I don't blame you if you didn't. It's not a normal thing to do. But just let's do that now. So let's unravel, let's deconstruct what a Google Analytics session is. So it's a group of interactions that takes place on a website. I think we can all agree on this, that this is a good description of what a session is. It's a group of interactions. There are page views and events. There are e-commerce transactions. There are cart additions. There are product detail views, social media shares. And when you group these all together, you get a session. And then you have so and so many sessions and so many users. But there's all this weird stuff happening. It has a 30-minute expiration window. 30 minutes after your last interaction on a website, the session expires. So if you do stuff on the website, then you go and walk your dog or something, then you come back and do some more stuff, the session has expired. A new session starts when you do the next thing. So let's say you're watching a video that is 31 minutes long and you're not tracking anything during that video play. A new session starts when you do something after watching the video. Interesting. Interesting thing. What in the real world expires after 30 minutes of interaction? I have no idea. It's an interesting choice of time. There's also the midnight cutoff point. Maybe you've heard of this. It's a weird thing. At exactly midnight of the time zone configured in your Google Analytics profile, all sessions end and new sessions start. So if you start browsing the site at 23:59:59, you have 1 second long of a session. And after midnight, a new session starts. Let's translate that again to the real world. What store throws it? That's an all-night store. What store throws their visitors out at midnight only to bring them back in right afterwards? Where's the real-life solution? What is this trying to solve in the real world? Or when the acquisition campaign changes. If you land on the site from an organic search keyword, but then you go back to Google, and then return to the site from a Google ad, it's 2 different sessions, even though you did them in immediate succession and not around midnight. So your campaign changed, so Google created a new session for you. Unless, of course, you add this in the referral exclusion list of your property, which is the way that you can manipulate this session algorithm. Or maybe it's cross-domain traffic. You're trying to move from simoahava.com to mariahava.com, my wife, but she doesn't really have that kind of a domain. That's a different top-level domain. That's a different parent domain. So unless I do cross-domain tracking, it's going to be 2 different users with 2 different sessions browsing those 2 sites. It's really difficult to implement, so most of the time these sessions are broken because there's an implementation problem. And then there's tools like Google Tag Manager, which promises to alleviate all your concerns. It gives you a fancy UI that obfuscates all that difficult code and shit. And you can just use the UI to deploy perfect Google Analytics implementations that take care of all of this stuff. That's not quite true. Then there's also something called session control. You can manually abort a session by sending a session control parameter with your hits. There's mobile and single page apps that make this whole thing really difficult again. There's server-side stuff going on that we don't know about. There's cookies, there's local storage, there's browser storage, there's persistence, so on, so on, so on. This is the deconstructed Google Analytics session. This is the algorithm that they devised in the laboratories of Mountain View some 10 years ago, or maybe even longer in Urchin. But this is the definition of a session. And why is this significant? Well, let's say you're presenting data in the boardroom, and you're showing these numbers. You're talking about conversion rates, e-commerce transaction rates. You're talking about bounce rates. You're talking about session duration. You're talking about pages per session. You're talking about session counts. How much do you consider that mess of an algorithm when you tell these numbers? How meaningful are those numbers when the whole thing underlying those numbers is so alien to the real world? So I'm willing to think that most people don't consider this, and that's fine. It just means that you might be working with bad data, but at least you're working consistently with that bad data. So it's equally bad all the time. So that means that it kind of evens itself out. Don't quote me on that, by the way. But the problem is here. This is a typical report. It's the acquisition report with the new look. It has users and new users now. All these metrics, all these dimensions that you see in Google Analytics are confined by the definitions put by Google Analytics that we are forced to use. There's no way to tell Google Analytics that this is a page view. Use this instead. There's no way, well, there's some ways, but it's very difficult to change the concept of a session as well. So all the metrics to where the red arrow points, all of them are by nature very volatile. You can change the timeout period of a session. It's found in the property settings, but you can change it from 30 minutes to something else. If you change it to 29 minutes, every single one of these metrics will change as a result. Not dramatically, but they will change just by tweaking a setting. That's how fragile this whole thing is. We're all living in a lie. You know, we're standing on thin ice and just waiting to jump through. These are really, really fragile metrics. They're very easy to manipulate. And I think one of the problems with our industry, and with our industry, I'm talking about CRO and analytics and SEO and all these digital verticals, is that we fall into the trap of talking about metrics. We get instructions to improve on a metric. We are asked to fix metrics instead of focusing on the underlying business logic that produces those metrics. Because metrics are fragile, they're ephemeral, they're ridiculously easy to manipulate. I've always had beef with conversion rate optimization. I can optimize conversion rates whenever I want. It's really easy to get 100% conversion rate anywhere. In Google Analytics, all you need to do is create a goal for every single page on the site. You'll have 100% conversion rate, which you can then present to your boss who gave you that target. I optimized conversion rate. I did nothing about optimizing conversions. I didn't touch the business logic underneath. So one of the things that we have to do when we use platforms like Google Analytics is we have to change the metrics to reflect the business realities that produce those metrics. We have to take what little Google Analytics offers us and bend it to our will, make it tell something about our organization, about our idiosyncrasies, rather than fall into the trap of using the default metrics that are wrong more often than not. And yet all the time there's the constant feedback of, at least we're doing something. You know, there are so many out there who don't care about data, at least we're collecting something. And that's fine, I get that. That's a very Finnish kind of thing, being kind of just above the rim, just above the bar. But I think we can be more ambitious than that. This is an example of Clipfolio, which is a fairly cheap visualization tool, which I tend to use quite a lot. I'm migrating to Google Data Studio, but I'm still very happy with Clipfolio. But anyway, this is a report. I'm sorry it's a bit unclear, but I'll try to explain it. This is a report I use in my own content performance analysis. And this is all based on Google Analytics data that I have modeled to better suit my own business needs. And we have things like scrolling and reading. So instead of just conversion rate, or instead of just page views, we're actually looking how much are people engaging with our content, how much they're scrolling it, how much they're reading it. Now, obviously, reading is a very difficult thing to model as a metric, but we have to choose a definition and stick by it. Then we have things like bounce time in SERPs. We want to know if people land on our site from Google search, do they immediately return? Or is there a correlation between this kind of a SERP bounce and how our pages are ranked in Google, for example? We have things like content funnels. People started reading. Did they reach 1/3, 2/3? Did they reach the end? How long were they on the page? Did they leave a comment? Did they do a social share? All important and interesting things that tell us people are engaged with our content. And then we have things like article performance, where we're looking at the actual interactive time that users spend on our content. So interactive time is, I'm going to actually get back to that very soon. But how are people engaging with our content? What sets these centerpiece contents apart from others? What kind of engagement triggers can we use to identify how people are engaging with our content? And the reason why I think, my answer to why customize is because we can customize. We can change Google Analytics. We can use the dimensions and metrics to better reflect our business, and I'm very, very certain that most of us should do that as well. And not just for content, for e-commerce as well. Google Analytics has a great set of e-commerce reports. Adobe has a great set of e-commerce reports, but they're still modeled after some kind of ideal that doesn't match the majority of web stores out there. Google Analytics enhanced e-commerce reports require that your store obeys a certain funnel. There's a product view followed by an add to cart action, followed by a checkout funnel, and finally a purchase event. But what about if you add things to cart directly from search? What about if you don't have a cart ad, you have a single product that you can just check out? This is the moment where Google Analytics default reports fall apart. And you have to start thinking, I still want to use these reports, but I have to modify my tool to better work with them. You will get these slides, and there are some links to further reading, by the way. So what we can do? Well, first of all, we can't fix everything with just one trick. This, like I said in the beginning, this is a constant state of dissatisfaction. We're constantly kind of pissed off. It's not that we're pissed off just once, then we fix it and then we're happy, but instead we're constantly kind of pissed off. And we can deconstruct something else. Let's talk about page views. Page views is a horribly named thing. It's just so wrong. It implies that somebody has viewed a page. Now, I don't know what your definition of viewing is, but to me it requires two eyes and a computer screen and a piece of content. And these are all somehow connected to each other. But Google Analytics doesn't care about that. Every time you open a page in a browser tab or a new window in the background, it's a page view. You're collecting page view from pages that were not viewed. If that doesn't strike you as odd, then I have miscalculated my target audience completely. But to me, I think it's a bit weird. So we can improve that. We can modify Google Analytics to only collect page views for pages that are visible in the viewport of the browser. So we can turn page views into a literal metric, a page that was viewed, or the page that the user had the chance to view. Add some eye tracking stuff there, and then you'll have a good metric. Then we can improve even that. We can start looking at maybe page views isn't enough. Maybe I want to know, in addition to viewing the page in the browser, maybe I can actually see how much they were engaging with the page, to separate those that simply viewed the page from those that actually engaged with it. And finally, we can get to the ultimate holy grail of engagement, which is that the user or visitor actually read the content. So it didn't just doodle around, but actually spend time to digest what was written. And the good thing about building this kind of a metric funnel, so this is a funnel of metrics basically, is we can also get the inverse. We get the abandonment stuff very easily. So people who made it to page views but never to visible page views, we can ditch them off as tab browsers. Or people who open the page in a new window and never looked at it. People who viewed the page but didn't engage, they were just idling, you know. They did open the window, maybe they were looking at the content but never did anything else. People who actually interacted with the page but never read it were maybe returning readers who've already read the document. Maybe somebody who skipped to comments. Maybe the content is just so long nobody reads it in one go. We get all these really useful metrics, and we are using these metrics to better tell us, are we meeting our engagement goals? And we can define these metrics by ourselves with some JavaScript and some web analytics collection magic. But the truth is that we can do this, it just requires some effort. And the question is this worth the effort? Well, I'm trying to show you that it is. We can do the same thing for time on page. Google is so bad with temporal metrics. Anything with time, by default, you can ignore that stuff. Typically, a time on page is calculated between the time delta between two page views, or the time between a page view and some events. So it's just timestamps compared to each other. The funny thing about average time on page is actually that the average metric, the average time on page, doesn't include the exit page, so the last page that was viewed. It counts as a 0-second time on page, which is kind of weird. Maybe they spent 3 hours on that page, you know, called all the phone numbers on the page, bought millions and millions of euros of equipment, but Google still tells they spent 0 seconds on the page, and you feel like that was a mistake, that this was a crap page. Well, we can improve this as well. We can calculate time on page for only visitors who were viewing the page. So start the timer when the page becomes visible. pause it if it becomes hidden, and then resume the timer if it's visible. So we'll have an average time on visible page. Again, a more meaningful metric. We want the users to be actually able to do something with the content, and that requires that the content is visible in the viewport. We're going to improve, we're going to go to engage time. And here engage time means that the user is actually interacting with the content, moving the mouse around, doodling, highlighting words, scrolling up and down, writing on the keypad, interacting with the page somehow. And then we'll get the read time in the end. We'll know what was the average time that users interacted with a piece of content and use that to benchmark our content. This centerpiece content was read so and so much, so we can use that to benchmark our content efforts. And again, we get the inverse. And it's the same abandonment funnel as before, this time just being used for temporal metrics. So we can do this. This is not just, well, these are just slides. I was going to say these are not just slides. These are just slides. You have to do the legwork yourself, but it's all out there, and there are some resources in this presentation to help you get along. But the only way you can do this, and now I'm not saying that go and look at those resources and copy-paste that stuff, because then you're doing the very thing that the evil people want you to do. But instead, think about what are your goals in your content, in your e-commerce, in your CRO work, and how do you turn the data platforms that you use, whether Optimizely or Google Analytics or Google's Optimize or whatever, and how can you make them tell more about your business? And just because I want to have some technical stuff here, of course, otherwise this would be a very, very boring presentation if there's not some code there. I want to show you how to measure what tracking interactive time means in this context. And this is using Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. So the end result will be this. You'll be able to look at your content, how many page views they receive. Now, this is the default page view metric. Don't hate me for that. We'll have the average time on page there, but we'll also have a new metric called average interactive time or average engage time. And when I did this run on my own blog, I got some really interesting results. The average interactive time was by default 7 times less than the average time on page. So the time the users were actually interacting with the visible content on my blog was 7 times less than what Google reported as the time on page. And this, at the very least, made me a bit concerned, because I had been looking at time on page as some sort of indicative of what users do on my site. But now I'm looking at, they're actually like making an effort to interact with the content for such a shorter amount of time that this discrepancy has to be significant in some way. I still haven't figured out what this means. I'm actually a very bad analyst. I'm good at writing this code, but I don't know how to interpret the numbers. But something's going on, right? You don't get that kind of a discrepancy without there being something meaningful underlying it. Maybe someone can tell me what's going on, and I'll be able to pay you with some good jokes or something. Anyway, this is what the code looks like. Feel free to take photos and then write it down yourself. There's a typo on row 52. I'm very sorry about that. It's a simple piece of JavaScript. It really is quite simple. The way it works is that each time you move your mouse, each time you scroll, each time you touch up on the keypad, a timer starts rolling. And as soon as you spend 5 seconds without doing any of these things, the timer pauses and sets you as idle. And then when you start doing stuff again the timer starts. And then it calculates the cumulative time of engagement when you try to leave the page, or when you do leave the page. There's no exit pop-ups in my site. When you do leave the page, it basically sends to Google Analytics the cumulative time you spent interacting with that page. And if this sounds familiar to you, it should be. I copied, or I plagiarized the algorithm from Chartbeat. So it does pretty much the same thing. They have a very similar algorithm, but they've been very open about their research, so it's very easy to plagiarize. Code can't be copyrighted, so it's fine. I wrote the whole thing myself. I'm just doing really bad jokes all the time. But anyway, this is very similar to what Chartbeat does. So it calculates all this stuff. It puts it together. It has a trigger for Google Tag Manager. We use some data layer stuff there. We send the information to Google Analytics in seconds. In Google Analytics, we create a custom metric to collect this information called total engage time. And then in our tag, we set a couple of things. We send the custom metric of the engaged time to Google Analytics. We use something called transport beacon, which is a very interesting field. A quick foray into transport beacon, because I have time. Transport beacon, do you know how annoying it is that when you collect data from Google to Google Analytics and you're collecting link click data, somebody clicks a link and they redirect it before the hit gets to Google Analytics? Maybe you do, maybe you've seen that sometime. Well, it happens, so it is there. So the browser redirects you before the hit to Google Analytics completes, and you might actually be missing quite a bit of data thanks to that behavior. Well, there's a field called transport whose value you can set to beacon, which uses Navigator's sendBeacon API of the web browser. And it basically protects your hits. It allows them to complete in the background, even if the user closed the browser. So even if the user shuts down the web browser, the hit will still complete to Google Analytics. So we're using that here. We're also using non-interaction true. We don't want these to be bounce-killing hits. No good reason. Bounce rate is insignificant, so that's why I don't really care about it. But here it just protects them. And then in Google Analytics, we create a calculated metric that calculates the total engaged time by page views. We create a custom report with our page views, average interactive time, calculated metric, and average time on page. And voila, we end up with this report. It's all documented there, so feel free to follow the steps to make it work on your own side. And again, this is crazy, 7 times difference. It's really, really crazy. And I really hope that somebody tells me why that is. Maybe Jono can do that. I hear he's good with numbers. But it's a big discrepancy. And the second thing I want to talk to you about is tracking content as e-commerce. Now, on content sites, sometimes you don't have any e-commerce, if it's a publisher site or a blog or something, but you still want to make use of those wonderful enhanced e-commerce reports that Google Analytics gives you. So what I decided to do is, again, I want to turn Google Analytics to tell me about my content. I want to use it as an engagement machine that tells me data that is relevant to myself. So I took the enhanced e-commerce paradigm and then just turn it around to tell me about my content rather than my product. So here we can look at this report. Now, each product is a piece of content on my site. These are article titles. Unique purchases are the number of time each article has been read. Reading means scroll to the bottom and spend a minute on the site. Completely arbitrary metric, but I'm tweaking it. We have things like product revenue. Now you might wonder what are euros in this case? Well, they are the number of words in each article. So I get the best vanity metric that a blogger can get, 11,200,000 words read on my site in the last month or so. Now, how's that for a pickup line at a bar? It's a very, very bad pickup line in a bar, by the way. Just, but it's a very interesting thing. I can see the average, how much each article has been read. I can see this is actually the word count of each article. There's no refunds. There's no product refund. I can't refund you for the crap that you read on my site. We have things like cart to detail rate. That's interesting. Now, what this actually means is out of all the people who opened the article, so the visible page views, how many scrolled it? Any amount of distance. Just scroll the article. As soon as you scroll the article, it's an add to cart action. So I get information that I'm actually pretty happy with those numbers. So only like 17% of my visitors just open an article and don't do anything about it. And then there's the buy to detail rate. Out of all the people who opened the article or the sessions or the times the articles were opened, how many people reached the end and read the article? Again, reaching the end and spending at least 1 minute on the site. And this is interesting stuff. My most read article is Variable Guide for Google Tag Manager. It has a sickly 15% read rate. That's low. But it's because it's a really long article and it's a reference tool. I don't expect people to follow the narrative. It's not an interesting novel. It's a really boring article about variables. And then again, a piece like e-commerce tips for Google Tag Manager is much shorter, only 3,000 words or something. And a third of the visitors read that. There's an article of just 1,000 words, fix the rogue referral problem in single-page sites. That's like a John Clancy novel right there. And it has a 35% read rate. So I get this information. I have turned Google Analytics into something that tells me about my own blog, about my content. I don't have to put up with the crappy bounce rate. not the bad, like as a metric, but as a definition, bounce rate itself is very unusable. I don't have to put up with page views. I don't have to put up with things like conversion rates. I can build those myself. I can turn the platform around to help me with my own business questions. So to wrap this up, I have 5 takeaways for you so that you can do this stuff at home. First of all, data quality is earned. Do not fall into the trap of thinking that when you add Google Analytics, you're getting good data. You might get good data. Some of it is very good. Most of it is non-descriptive. It doesn't help you. It doesn't tell you anything about your business. It's not tailored to your problems. You have to work towards it. You have to invest time, money, and resources to make analytics work for you. Google Analytics is very generic out of the box. The default metrics and dimensions might work for a very typical website. For a website that adheres to all the kind of waterfall model funnels and all this kind of stuff. But the websites of today, single-page sites, working with frameworks that modern frameworks, just simply do not work with the kind of system that Google Analytics gives us out of the box. So we have to configure the tool. So we have to configure the platforms that we use, not just Google Analytics. We have to configure all the platforms that we use to tell more meaningful information about our businesses. And content is just something I'm quite passionate about for a very good reason. But also because typically engagement is such a difficult thing that it touches upon all the difficult parts of a web analytics process. Data collection, data processing, reporting, they're all part of how to make content more meaningful and how to represent that with the metrics that we use in Google Analytics or any of the tools we use. So it's a good proxy. If you have content on your site or your blog or your company site, it's a good idea to start thinking about engagement and then use those lessons to track all the other stuff there as well. And finally, knowledge about web tech, I consider it a must. I consider that everybody in this room should get the JavaScript basic course at least under their belt at www.codecademy.com. It's almost necessary. I think it's very difficult to navigate the digital world without understanding of the web tech stack. So finally, data is difficult. We wouldn't be here if this stuff wasn't difficult. It wouldn't be a multi-billion-dollar business if this wasn't difficult. It is very difficult, and we can do our best to navigate these waters with the help of people like John and conferences like this where we can share ideas. And hopefully this has been useful for you, and please do download the slides later on. Thank you very much.